The first time I noticed Carter, he was already walking out the door. It was an evening in the fall, and the executive floor of Harrington Group was still buzzing. Analysts were hunched over spreadsheets, associates were refilling their coffee, and the glass-walled conference room on the east side was packed with senior partners arguing over projections. I stood near my office window, arms crossed, watching the city of Chicago glow amber beneath a sinking sun. I had been the CEO of this firm since I was young, handed the role not because my last name was on the building, but because no one else in the family had the nerve to take it. I ran the company with the precision of a surgeon and the instinct of a gambler. I had closed deals that made front-page headlines. I had fired board members twice my age without flinching. My personal life, by contrast, was almost non-existent. I had never had a relationship that lasted very long, not because I couldn't attract someone, but because I never stayed long enough to let anyone matter more than the next quarterly report. That evening, as I glanced down at the open floor below my office, I noticed a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark skin and close-cropped hair. He wore a simple navy blazer over a white shirt, no tie, no flash. He was packing up his bag at a desk near the window, moving with a calm efficiency that stood out against the frantic energy of the room. While everyone else was still grinding, this man was leaving. I checked the time, but he was heading out right on schedule. His name, I would learn later, was Carter. He had joined the data analytics division some time earlier, transferred from a smaller firm in Milwaukee. He was quiet, highly competent, the kind of employee who never raised his voice in meetings, but whose reports were so sharp that even the senior partners read them twice. He didn't seek promotions. He didn't volunteer for after-hours projects. He did his work thoroughly, precisely, and then he left every single day right when the workday ended. Nobody questioned it at first. People assumed he had a long commute or maybe a second job. But as time passed and the pattern never broke, not during busy seasons, not during the holiday crunch, not even on the night the firm landed its biggest client of the year, his strict schedule became something people whispered about. Not with judgment exactly, more with curiosity. In a company where long hours were a badge of honor, his rigid schedule was almost rebellious. I didn't think much of it until the morning he saved the company millions. It arrived as an email with the subject line revised, risk assessment for our investment strategy. Carter had reanalyzed the firm's entire investment plan, cross-referencing it against market volatility data that the senior analysts had overlooked. His conclusion was direct and devastating. The strategy had a critical flaw that could expose the firm to massive losses if the bond market shifted even slightly. He laid it out in pages of clean, airtight analysis with no ego, no dramatic language, just the numbers and what they meant. I read the report several times. Then I called an emergency meeting with the investment committee. Soon after, the strategy had been restructured. The board later estimated that Carter's analysis had saved us a significant amount in potential exposure. I wanted to meet him in person. I found him at his desk one afternoon finishing a data visualization that most people in his department wouldn't have attempted. He stood when I approached, respectful but not nervous. Up close, I noticed his hands were large and steady, and his eyes, dark brown, almost black, held a kind of quiet gravity that made me feel like he was truly listening even before I spoke. "That report was exceptional," I said. Carter nodded once. "I'm glad it was useful." I asked him to join a working dinner with the executive team to discuss the restructured strategy. His insight would be valuable. Carter looked at me directly. "I appreciate the invitation," he said, "but I won't be able to make it." I waited for an explanation. A conflict, a prior commitment, an apology. None came. He simply held my gaze with a calm certainty that made his refusal feel less like a rejection and more like a fact, something settled long before I had asked. I walked back to my office unsure of what had just happened. People did not say no to me like that, not without explanation, and certainly not without at least pretending to consider it first. Over the weeks that followed, I found myself paying closer attention to Carter. Not deliberately, or at least that's what I told myself. It started with glances from my office window. I would look down at the open floor and find myself scanning for his desk, checking if he was there, watching how he moved through the day. He arrived every morning, greeted his colleagues with a nod and a quiet word, and settled into his work with a focus that never seemed to waver. People liked him not because he was charismatic or funny, but because he was reliable. When someone needed help with a data set, Carter walked over and sat with them until it was done. He never made anyone feel small for asking. And then right before he left each day, something shifted. I first noticed it on a rainy day. I was passing through the analytics floor on my way to a meeting when I saw him reach for his phone. He glanced at the screen and his entire demeanor changed. The composed, slightly guarded expression he wore at work softened into something warmer. He smiled, not the polite, measured smile he gave colleagues, but a real one, wide and unguarded. He spoke quietly into the phone, just a few words, his voice low and gentle. Then he hung up, slid the phone into his pocket, and began packing his bag. I saw this happen again and again, always right before leaving, always the same transformation from professional stillness to something tender and unhurried. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between two analysts near the break room. A woman named Grace was telling a coworker about something she had seen in the shared kitchen earlier that day. Carter had 2 lunches, Grace said, half laughing, like 2 separate containers. One was normal, but the other one was tiny, like a kid's portion, and the vegetables were cut into little star shapes. I've never seen a grown man carry a lunchbox with star-shaped carrots. The coworker shrugged it off, but I, standing just around the corner with my coffee, didn't. A few days later, I walked past his desk while he was in a meeting. His workspace was clean, almost minimalist, a laptop, a notebook, a pen holder. But tucked into the corner, half hidden behind his monitor, was a small piece of paper, a crayon drawing, 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a sky full of blue raindrops. One figure was tall, the other was small. They were both smiling. I looked at the drawing for a long moment. Something about it tugged at me in a way I didn't expect. I didn't know who had drawn it or what it meant, but I knew it mattered to him because in a desk stripped of every personal detail, this was the one thing he had kept. I invited him to dinner again soon after. This time I kept it simple, just a casual meal at a restaurant near the office. No business agenda. Carter shook his head gently. Thank you, but I can't. I tried again later. A weekend conference in New York. I framed it as a professional opportunity, a chance for him to present his work to a wider audience. I appreciate it, Carter said, but weekends don't work for me. After that, I asked him for coffee on a Saturday morning. Nothing formal, just coffee. He looked at me with something that might have been warmth, or maybe it was sympathy. I'm sorry, Brooke. I can't. What confused me most was what he didn't do. He didn't avoid me. He didn't act cold or dismissive. In meetings, he still offered his analysis with the same steady clarity. When we crossed paths in the hallway, he still nodded, still said good morning. There was no tension, no awkwardness. He treated me with genuine respect, the kind that didn't bend under the weight of hierarchy. And yet, he never gave me an inch. It was my friend and general counsel, Megan Hayes, who finally said what I hadn't considered. We were sitting in my office late one evening, reviewing a contract when Megan set down her pen and looked at me. Can I say something you're not going to like? I raised an eyebrow. You're the CEO, Megan said. When you invite someone who works for you to dinner, someone 3 levels below you on the org chart, do you really think they feel free to say no? The words landed harder than Megan probably intended. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I had never thought about it from that angle. In my mind, my invitations had always been personal, separate from the office, separate from power. But Megan was right. To him, I wasn't just a woman asking a man to dinner. I was the woman who signed off on his performance reviews, who could influence his career, who controlled the entire structure within which he worked. Every time I asked whether I meant to or not, I was asking from a position of authority. That night, I lay in bed and replayed every interaction. Carter's refusals, his calm voice, the way he never flinched, and I realized something. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't protecting himself from my power. His no had nothing to do with who I was at Harrington Group. It came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere I hadn't been allowed to see. That realization didn't quiet my curiosity. If anything, it deepened it. Because if his refusal wasn't about fear, and it wasn't about disinterest, then what was it about? The question followed me through the winter. I stopped asking him to dinner. I stopped engineering reasons to pass by his desk, but I couldn't stop wondering what Carter was protecting and why it mattered more to him than anything I could offer. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did, slow, wet, and uncertain. The cherry blossoms along Michigan Avenue bloomed in pale clusters, and the rain softened from the heavy downpours of winter into something lighter, almost gentle. Inside Harrington Group, the new fiscal year brought a wave of fresh projects, and the building hummed with the particular energy that came from money in motion. I had kept my distance from Carter for some time. I no longer found excuses to walk through the analytics floor. I no longer lingered near the elevators before he left. I had taken Megan's words seriously, and though I never said so out loud, I was grateful for them. The last thing I wanted was to be the kind of leader who confused authority with intimacy. But distance didn't erase awareness. I still noticed him, not because I was looking, but because he was impossible to ignore in the way that quiet, consistent people often are. I noticed that he never missed a day of work. I noticed that he always ate lunch alone at his desk, never in the cafeteria. I noticed that when the rest of the analytics team stayed late for a project deadline, Carter would finish his portion early so that his departure never left anyone else carrying his weight. He didn't cut corners. He simply worked faster and cleaner than everyone around him, as though the clock on the wall wasn't a suggestion, but a contract he had signed with someone who mattered more than his employer. The Sunday it happened, I hadn't planned to go to the office. I had spent the night before at a fundraiser downtown, one of those events where everyone smiled too much and said too little, and I had come home restless. I tried reading. I tried watching something on television. I tried sitting on my balcony with a glass of wine staring at Lake Michigan. Nothing worked. By morning, I was in my car driving to the office because the only place that had ever made me feel competent was behind my desk. The building was empty. Security had waved me through with a familiar nod. I came in on weekends more often than I cared to admit. The elevator carried me to the executive floor in silence. I stepped out, turned the corner toward my office, and stopped. Through the glass wall of the large conference room on the east side, I could see a figure sitting alone at the long table. Laptop open but untouched, a paper coffee cup beside him. He wasn't working. He was looking out the window at the gray Sunday sky. And there was something in his posture, the slight drop of his shoulders, the way his hands rested flat on the table that made him look different from the Carter I saw on weekdays. Not smaller exactly, just unguarded, like a man who had set down something heavy and was allowing himself for a few minutes to feel the weight of having carried it. Carter turned his head and saw me standing there. Neither of us moved for a moment. Then he lifted his chin in a small nod, the same greeting he gave everyone, but this time it carried an unspoken question. I walked to the conference room door and opened it. "I didn't expect anyone else today," I said. "Neither did I." His voice was calm, but there was a weariness in it I hadn't heard before. I sat down across from him, the long table stretched between us, polished and empty. Through the window, Chicago spread out in shades of gray and green. "Do you come in on Sundays often?" I asked. Carter shook his head. "Zoe is with her grandmother this weekend." I didn't know what to do with the quiet. It was the first time he had ever mentioned a name to me that wasn't in a spreadsheet. I registered it, but didn't press. I simply sat with him, and for a while we talked about small things. The weather, a documentary we had both happened to watch, the new coffee machine on one of the floors that nobody could figure out how to operate. It was the longest conversation we had ever had, and it felt nothing like the brief, careful exchanges at the office. Without the building full of people, without the weight of titles and org charts, we were just two people sitting in a quiet room on a Sunday morning. And then, because I had never been good at leaving a question unasked, I said it. "Why won't you date me?" I hadn't planned it. The words came out steady, but there was a rawness beneath them that surprised even me. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't flirtation. It was the question I'd been carrying for months, stripped of every layer of strategy and pride, offered plainly. Carter looked at me. His expression didn't change. No surprise, no discomfort. He had known this question was coming. Maybe he had known it since the first time I invited him to that working dinner months ago. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen twice, then turned it toward me and set it on the table between us. On the screen was a photograph of a little girl. She was black, standing on a sidewalk in a bright yellow raincoat. She was laughing so hard that both her eyes were squeezed shut, her mouth wide open, her small hands gripping the edges of her hood. Behind her, the sidewalk was slick with rain, and a row of blurred streetlights glowed orange in the distance. It was the kind of photograph that felt alive, like if you listened closely enough, you could hear her laughter coming through the glass. "Her name is Zoe," Carter said. "She's my daughter." I looked at the photograph for a long time. The little girl's joy was so uncontained, so complete that it almost hurt to look at. I thought of the crayon drawing on Carter's desk, the two stick figures in the rain, and suddenly the tall one and the small one had faces. "She's beautiful," I said quietly. Carter took the phone back and held it in both hands the way someone holds something that is more valuable than anything else they own. Then he began to talk. His wife's name was Vanessa. They had met in college at Howard University during their sophomore year. She was studying education. He was studying mathematics. They married in her mother's backyard in Philadelphia with folding chairs and a borrowed speaker playing Stevie Wonder. Zoe came 4 years later, a late surprise that turned their careful, quiet life upside down in the best possible way. When Zoe was 3, Vanessa started getting headaches, not the ordinary kind. These were sharp, sudden, and they didn't go away. By the time she saw a specialist, the diagnosis was already late. Glioblastoma stage 4. The doctors were honest. Treatment might buy time, but it wouldn't buy enough. Vanessa lived for 4 more months. Carter took a leave of absence from work and stayed with her every day. Zoe was too young to understand what was happening, but she knew something was wrong. She would crawl into her mother's hospital bed and press her face into Vanessa's neck as though she was trying to hold her in place. The morning Vanessa died, it was raining. Carter sat in the hospital hallway for hours after, unable to move. The only thing that pulled him to his feet was a nurse who came to tell him that Zoe was awake in the waiting room asking for him. He walked in. Zoe looked up at him from a plastic chair holding a picture book she couldn't yet read and said, "Daddy, I'm hungry." Carter picked her up. He carried her to the hospital cafeteria. He bought her a muffin and a carton of orange juice. And while she ate, he made a decision that would define every day of his life from that point forward. He would be there, not sometimes, not when it was convenient. Every single day, he would be present for his daughter in the way that her mother no longer could be. He moved from Philadelphia to Milwaukee to start over. Vanessa's mother, Gloria, followed them, unwilling to let her granddaughter grow up without family close by. Carter rebuilt his career, slowly taking positions that allowed him to leave on time. When the opportunity at Harrington Group came, better pay, better title, a move to Chicago, he took it only after Gloria agreed to make the move with them. She found an apartment close by, and every day she watched Zoe until Carter came to pick her up. Every day followed the same rhythm. He left the office right on time. He arrived at Gloria's apartment soon after. Zoe would be waiting by the door, sometimes in her school clothes, sometimes already in pajamas if it had been a long day. They walked home together, no matter the weather. They cooked dinner side by side, Zoe standing on a step stool at the counter, stirring whatever was in the pot with both hands. After dinner, homework. After homework, reading. Carter sat on the edge of her bed every night and read to her until her eyes closed. Then he kissed her forehead, turned off the light, and went to the kitchen to clean up. "Every evening belongs to her," Carter said. His voice was steady, but there was a depth beneath the steadiness, the kind of depth that only comes from saying something you have lived, not rehearsed. I didn't speak. I was watching his face, and what I saw there was not the composed, slightly distant man I had studied from across conference rooms and through office windows. What I saw was a father, tired, devoted, and carrying a weight that he had never once asked anyone to share. The conference room was very quiet. Outside, a seagull passed the window in a slow, lazy arc. Carter set his phone down on the table. He looked at the screen at Zoe's laughing face, and then he looked at me. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, rougher, as though he was pulling the words up from a place he didn't often visit. "You think I don't want to say yes?" My breath caught. "There are nights," he said. "After Zoe falls asleep when the house is so quiet, I can hear the clock on the wall, just the ticking over and over. And I sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that's gone cold, and I think about what it would be like to have someone sitting across from me again." He ran his thumb slowly across the edge of his phone case. "I think about conversations that aren't about homework or bedtime or what's for lunch tomorrow. I think about someone laughing at something I said. I think about not being the only adult in the room every single night." He looked at me, really looked at me without the professional distance he usually maintained. But I made a promise to myself, to Zoe, that I would never let her feel like she came second. Not to a job, not to ambition, not to a woman, not to anything. The words filled the room and stayed there. I felt them land somewhere deep in a place I didn't have a name for. I understood now why his refusals had never felt cold. They weren't cold, they were the opposite. They came from a place of such deep love that there was simply no room for anything else. Carter wasn't rejecting me. He was holding on to someone who needed him more. But what shook me, what made me see him entirely differently in that moment, was the loneliness. He wasn't a man who had chosen solitude because he wanted it. He had chosen it because the alternative meant giving his daughter less, and he would rather sit alone at that kitchen table, listening to the clock, than take even one evening away from a little girl who had already lost her mother. Carter straightened in his chair. When he spoke again, his voice had returned to that familiar calm. But now I heard what lived beneath it. "If I start dating you," he said, "I'd have to take that time from her. The walks home, the cooking, the reading before bed, that's not extra time. That's the only time I have." He looked down at the photograph one more time. "Right now she needs me more than anyone else ever will." The sentence landed in the space between us and stayed there, enormous and simple. I looked at the man sitting across the conference table from me, this quiet, exhausted, profoundly decent man, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not attraction, not curiosity, something deeper and more disorienting. It was the recognition that I was looking at someone who had answered a question I had never thought to ask. What would you sacrifice everything for? Carter had an answer. It was his daughter, and she wore a yellow raincoat, and she was waiting for him to come home. I had no answer at all. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't awkward or tense. It was the silence of two people who had finally seen each other clearly and understood that what we saw changed everything. After a while, Carter stood. He picked up his coffee cup and his phone. He nodded to me, that same small, respectful nod, and walked out of the conference room. I sat alone at the long table. The sky outside the window had begun to brighten, and somewhere far below, the city was waking up. I thought about the crayon drawing on his desk, two stick figures in the rain. I thought about star-shaped carrots in a tiny lunchbox. I thought about a man who worked faster than everyone in the building, not because he wanted a promotion, but because he had someone to get home to. And I thought about my own apartment, the silence waiting for me there, the wine glass on the counter, the emails that would fill the hours until I fell asleep. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I did not want to go back to work. I drove home that day with the windows down, even though the air was cold and damp. The penthouse was exactly as I had left it, spotless, quiet, expensive. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view of Lake Michigan that most people would pay a fortune to wake up to. The kitchen counters were bare except for a bottle of wine I had opened the night before. The living room smelled faintly of the candle I kept on the coffee table, but rarely lit. I stood in the middle of the room and looked around as though I were seeing the place for the first time. Every surface was clean. Every object was in its place, and there was no one, not a single person, who would notice if I didn't come home tonight or tomorrow night or the night after that. I thought about Carter's kitchen. I had never seen it, but I could picture it. Small, warm, slightly cluttered, a step stool by the counter, a pot on the stove, a little girl stirring something with both hands, while her father stood beside her close enough to catch whatever might spill. I could picture the table where they sat across from each other every night, and I could picture the silence after Zoe fell asleep, the silence he had described so honestly that it had felt like a confession. He had a table with 2 chairs. I had a penthouse with none that mattered. That night, I did not open my laptop. I sat on the couch and stared at the ceiling, and the question Carter had unknowingly planted in my mind repeated itself like a pulse. What am I actually building my life around? I had always had an answer for that. The firm, the portfolio, the next acquisition, the next quarterly report, the next board meeting. My life had been a series of targets, clear, measurable, achievable, and I had hit every single one. I had built Harrington Group into one of the most respected investment firms in the Midwest. I had earned the respect of people twice my age and 3 times my experience. By every metric that the world used to define success, I was extraordinary. But Carter didn't measure his life by metrics. He measured it by whether he made it to the door on time. He measured it by star-shaped carrots and bedtime stories and a little girl's laughter in a yellow raincoat. And somehow, sitting across from him in that empty conference room, I had felt for the first time that his measurements were more honest than mine. The next morning I went to work at my usual time. I sat through my usual meetings. I reviewed my usual reports. Nothing had changed except everything had. Soon after, I closed my laptop earlier than usual. It was the earliest I had left the office on a weekday in over a year. I took the elevator down, walked to the parking garage, sat in my car, and realized I had nowhere to go. There was no one to meet, no dinner to prepare, no voice waiting on the other side of a front door. I drove home, poured a glass of wine, and opened my laptop again. By late, I was answering emails from overseas. The next day, I did the same thing. Left earlier, sat in my car, drove home to silence, opened the laptop. Soon, I had stopped pretending. Later, I tried something different. I picked up my phone one afternoon and called my mother. It was the first time in months. My mother lived in Connecticut, a flight away, and an emotional distance far greater. The conversation was short and stiff. My mother asked how work was going. I said, fine. My mother asked if I was seeing anyone. I said, no. My mother asked if I was happy. The question hung in the air for so long that my mother eventually said, well, I'm glad you called, and changed the subject to the weather. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and pressed my hands against my face. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in years, but there was a hollowness inside me that I couldn't fix with a phone call or a spreadsheet. Later, a major acquisition target surfaced, a tech company in New York that had been on Harrington Group's radar for some time. The opportunity was enormous. I threw myself into it the way I always had, long days, back-to-back calls, meals skipped or eaten standing up in front of my desk. It felt familiar. It felt safe. The adrenaline of a deal in motion was the only drug I had ever needed, and for a few days it worked. The question in my mind went quiet. Then, one night I was standing at the window of my office late reviewing term sheets when I caught my own reflection in the glass. Behind me, the building was dark. Every floor below was empty. The cleaning crew had come and gone hours ago. I was the only person left in a building that held hundreds of people during the day. And I thought of Carter not the way I used to, with curiosity or attraction or the desire to understand. I thought of him the way you think of someone who has shown you something you cannot unsee. I pictured him at that moment, late at night, and I knew exactly where he was. He was home. Zoe was asleep. The dishes were done. Maybe he was sitting at that kitchen table with his cold coffee, listening to the clock. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was lonely. But he was where he had chosen to be. And I was where I had defaulted to because I had never chosen anything else. I set down the term sheets. I turned off my office light. I took the elevator down to the parking garage and drove home. When I got there, I did not open my laptop. I sat at my kitchen counter, a marble slab that had never once been used for cooking, and I stayed there in the quiet until I fell asleep. The change didn't come as a revelation. It came slowly over time in small and imperfect steps. I started calling my mother every week. The conversations were still short, still a little awkward, but they were becoming something. My mother began telling stories about the garden. I began actually listening. I left the office earlier most evenings. Not every evening. There were still nights when the work demanded more and I gave it. But the difference was that I noticed now. I noticed when the building emptied. I noticed when the sky turned dark. I noticed the choice I was making every time I stayed. One morning, I went to a farmer's market near downtown. I had passed it 100 times in my car, but had never stopped. I bought tomatoes, basil, a loaf of bread. That evening, I stood in my kitchen and made pasta from scratch, a recipe I had found on my phone, simple enough that I couldn't ruin it. The pasta was overcooked and the sauce was too salty, and I ate it alone at the counter. But the apartment smelled like garlic and olive oil instead of nothing. And when I went to bed that night, the silence felt different, not empty, just quiet. I didn't tell anyone about these changes. I didn't post about them or announce them. They were mine, small, private, unglamorous. And I understood in a way I hadn't before that this was how real change worked. Not as a grand transformation, but as a series of tiny decisions that no one else would ever see. At the office, Carter and I still crossed paths in meetings, in hallways, in the elevator. He still nodded. I still nodded back. We didn't talk about that Sunday morning, and I didn't bring it up. I no longer looked at him with the restless curiosity that had driven me for months. What I felt now was something quieter, a steady, unspoken respect for a man who had built his life around a promise and never broken it. Time passed. Summer came to Chicago. Long evenings, golden light, the kind of warmth that made people walk slower and smile more. I had just closed the New York acquisition. It was the biggest deal in Harrington Group's history, and the celebration at the office lasted until late, but I left on time. I drove home, called my mother, and told her about the deal. My mother said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Did you eat dinner?" I laughed a real laugh and said I was about to. It was an evening almost a year since I had first noticed him walking out the door when I stepped into the elevator right as the workday ended. Carter was already inside. We looked at each other. All of it lived in the space between us, unspoken but fully understood. I smiled. "Still leaving on time?" Carter smiled back. "Always." The elevator descended through the glass walls. The Chicago skyline caught the last amber light of the day, the same light I had watched from my office window when the world outside my building was just scenery. "Zoe drew a lot lately," Carter said. His voice carried the warmth I had first heard through that phone call. Only now I knew who it belonged to. "She drew that same picture, the one with the two people walking in the rain." I remembered the crayon drawing on his desk. Two stick figures holding hands under blue raindrops. But this time, Carter said, she drew 3 people. He didn't explain what the third figure meant. He didn't need to. He simply looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between gratitude and hope held carefully like a match cupped against the wind. The elevator doors opened. We stepped out into the cool evening air. The street was alive with people heading home. Briefcases and backpacks, earbuds and umbrellas. The rhythm of a city winding down. Carter turned toward the train station across the street, and there, standing near the entrance with a red knit hat pulled low over her ears, was a little girl. She was bouncing on her toes, scanning the crowd. And the moment she saw Carter, her face broke into a grin so wide it seemed to light up the entire block. She waved with both hands. Not a polite wave, but the kind of frantic, joyful wave that only a child waiting for her favorite person in the world can produce. Carter raised his hand and waved back. Then he looked at me one last time, nodded, and walked across the street toward his daughter. I watched him go. I watched Zoe grab his hand with both of hers. I watched them turn and walk together toward the platform, the tall figure and the small one side by side, just like the drawing. I stood there for a moment, the evening air cool against my face. Then I turned and walked in the opposite direction, not toward the parking garage, not toward the office, but down the street toward the water, where the last light of the day was turning Lake Michigan into gold. I didn't know exactly where I was going. But for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't going back to work. And somewhere in my chest, in the place where the question had lived for months, I felt something settle. Not an answer exactly, but the beginning of one. Love is not always about keeping someone by your side. Sometimes it is about respecting the reason they have to go home. Carter never broke his promise, and I, for the first time in my life, finally understood what a promise like that was worth. Some people chase success, some people chase love, and some people, the rare ones, simply show up every single day right on time without fail for the one person who matters most. Maybe that's the kind of love this world needs more of. And if this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of someone who shows up for you or someone you need to show up for, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below and tell me who is your person, who is the person you'd rearrange your whole life for. And if you haven't told them lately, maybe today is a good day to start. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. That Sunday morning in the quiet conference room changed me forever. Sitting across from Carter, watching the way his eyes softened when he spoke about Zoe, I realized something profound that still brings tears to my eyes whenever I think about it. The greatest love isn't always the kind that sweeps you off your feet or fills your calendar with romantic dinners. Sometimes the deepest, most beautiful love looks like a man who chooses to walk out the door at exactly the same time every single day, no matter how tempting the promotion, how important the meeting, or how much the CEO wants his attention. It's the love that rearranges everything else so a little girl in a yellow raincoat never has to wonder if she comes second. Carter taught me that real strength isn't measured by how late you stay at the office or how many deals you close. It's measured by the promises you keep when no one is watching. He showed me that success without presence is just noise, and that the most valuable thing we can ever give someone is our time, fully and consistently. In a world that glorifies hustle and endless ambition, Carter quietly reminded me that the richest lives are built around the people who need us most. He didn't just go home at 5:30. He showed up for his daughter with his whole heart every single day. And that kind of devotion? It's rare. It's powerful. It's the kind of love this world desperately needs more of. If this story touched something deep inside you, if it made you think about your own life and the people waiting for you at home, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, who is your 530? Who is the person you would rearrange your whole world for? And if you haven't told them lately how much they mean to you, maybe today is the perfect day to start. Drop A if Carter's quiet strength moved you, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded what truly matters. If you want more stories that warm your heart and challenge how you live, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Thank you for being here. Your presence means more than you know.